So I'm gonna be honest with you guys, it's my last video before Halloween and this isn't the werewolf movie that I want to talk about. But hey, it's a classic Universal monster movie, so let's do it. The Wolfman. So The Wolfman came out in 1941 and is the next classic Universal monster movie that added a new face to horror, and that face was Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, or Larry Talbot. And yes, he was the son of classic horror icon Lon Chaney, who was the Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and many others. So Jr. has a bit of a reputation to uphold in the legacy of iconic monster makeups. So this movie does follow Larry Talbot after his brother dies and he returns to Wales, reconnects with his father, and looks over the Talbot estates because now he will inherit it after his father dies. And his father is played by Claude Rains, who is just one of the best actors working at that time. He's amazing. But it is a little weird seeing him standing next to Lon Chaney Jr. because Claude Rains is not the biggest guy, and Lon Chaney Jr. is. I mean, he played Lenny in Of Mice and Men a couple years ago, so he's a pretty big, tall guy, and it's just kind of funny seeing them next to each other because I'm just here thinking, like, are you two related? Because your heights and statures are drastically different. And while it is a little distracting and a little goofy when you first see it, the caliber of acting coming out of Claude Rains and Lon Chaney Jr. helped to make it a bit more believable. But anyway, when Larry comes back home, he immediately falls in love with Gwen Conliffe, played by Evelyn Ankers. And they have some cute scenes together, but she more or less just spouts exposition about werewolves that help us understand kind of the lore of this town. It seems like this town is obsessed with werewolves and it's part of their culture and legend. And she says the classic line, "Even a man that's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright." And while that rhyme is just immediately catchy and sticks in your head, it does bring up an interesting thing that this movie does that's different from a lot of other werewolf movies, and it's that this Wolfman doesn't transform during a full moon. His transformation isn't dependent on the fullness of the moon, but more in the season where the moon shines. So it being autumn, he'll transform basically every night where there's a moon out until winter comes, and then he'll be good for the rest of the year until autumn comes again, and he'll wolf out every night. And if I'm being honest, I kind of like this version of werewolf lore better than the full moon one, just because from a filmmaking perspective, you get more opportunities to showcase the werewolf and the wolfing out every night versus just one night a month, and now you've got 30 days of downtime with no werewolf until it loops back around and he wolfs out again. And that's something that a lot of werewolf movies struggle with, is how do you keep it interesting in between the full moons. But here it really doesn't matter. It's autumn, the moon is out every night, so he's gonna wolf out every night. Which not only makes it more entertaining for us, but it raises the stakes in the movie because every night someone's in danger. Someone might die because he doesn't have control of his body. But all the talk of werewolves and lycanthropy doesn't scare Larry Talbot, so he asks Gwen out to go see the gypsies that are passing through to get their fortunes read and whatever else gypsies do and sell. So they go out and Gwen brings one of her friends to go too, so the three of them go see the gypsies, and we see Bela Lugosi as the gypsy Bella. And it's so nice to see him in this movie because after Dracula, he kind of got typecast as Dracula and didn't get a whole lot of work after. It kind of ruined his career just because of how iconic Dracula became. But unlike Boris Karloff, who also got typecast as playing monsters, Karloff got the lead, so at least he got to star in his monster movies. Bela Lugosi was mostly cast as supporting roles and usually playing second fiddle to the main monster of the movie. And here it's kind of the same thing, but he's not just a hunchback or a servant. He is the original werewolf of this story. He attacks the girl that I don't remember her name, and then Larry comes over and beats this wolf to death with his silver cane, and turns out it was Bela the fortune teller all along. So now everybody's confused. Was it a wolf? Was it a man? And how guilty is Larry Talbot of murder if Bela wasn't the one attacking the girl? And this is where the movie actually gets pretty interesting. It's this whole investigation. But there's a couple things that just don't make it work as well as the director probably intended it to. And one of those is the inconsistency of what a werewolf looks like in this movie. Because when Bela was the werewolf attacking the girl, it was just a normal looking wolf. It didn't have any kind of human attributes. It wasn't a dude in makeup. It wasn't kind of an anthropomorphized wolf. It was just a regular looking wolf that Bela transformed into. But after Larry Talbot gets scratched and he starts transforming into what we know as the Wolfman, he's a wolfman. He's half man, half wolf. And it just makes me question if that's what happens when you become a werewolf and you look like that, then what was Bela? Because he's obviously not the same kind of werewolf as Larry Talbot, because they look completely different when they're fully transformed. And the second thing that kind of hurts this movie is that the audience isn't forced to seriously question Larry Talbot's mental state like everybody else is. Now, I don't know how true this is, but I have heard that originally they were not going to show the werewolf transformations, and that it was going to be left fairly ambiguous as to whether or not Lon Chaney Jr. was actually the person in the werewolf makeup running around killing people. But then the studio wanted a transformation sequence, so then they had to go back and reshoot that and do it the way they did. And I can't help but feel like if they didn't show the werewolf transformations during the movie and only showed it at the very end when Larry dies, it would have been way more resonant with the audience, because the whole movie we are also questioning, okay, is he the werewolf? Is he not? Is that somebody else? And while we probably would have come to the conclusion that, yeah, he is the werewolf before the reveal at the end, it still makes those conversations with the dad and the doctor and Will Scarlet, yeah, he's in this movie, feel a bit more relevant and a bit more engaging, because we don't have all the answers. But with the movie as is, we do have the answers. We saw him transform. We know that he is the werewolf and that he's not crazy. So these conversations feel a little redundant and unnecessary after we've already seen him transform. But let's talk about this werewolf transformation that they pulled off for this movie. Well, it's okay. Honestly, nothing is ever going to top, for me, the transformation sequence of American Werewolf in London. And it is kind of a shame that I saw American Werewolf in London before I ever saw the original Wolfman. So my frame of reference and gold standard for werewolf transformation has been that movie and the amazing makeup work. And for my money, it still is the gold standard. I haven't seen any werewolf movie top it. And it's just a shame that while the transformations in the Wolfman are effective, they're just not very interesting. They're done with dissolves as you see more hair grow and you see the feet get bigger, but it's very rudimentary, and I do understand the limitations of the time period. And with those limitations, I think they did a great job, but it's just not as visceral and painful and engaging as American Werewolf in London, or even The Howling or the Wolfman remake. It's just very basic. And this Wolfman makeup, like most of the monsters that came before, were done by Jack Pierce, the king of monster makeups. He's made so many great monster looks, and the Wolfman isn't one of them. I know it's an iconic look, and a lot of you may disagree with me, and that's okay, but for me, he never looked very wolfish to me. He always looked a bit more like a bear man, not so much a wolf man. I think it has to do with kind of just the rounded nature of the makeup, and to me, bears are rounder than wolves. Wolves are more streamlined and angular, and the lack of a snout really throws this makeup off. I don't really know how he would have achieved a snouty werewolf look in 1941, but that lack of a snout really hurts this makeup, and it just doesn't read like wolf to me. And maybe if this look was like the halfway transformation point or 3/4 transformation, and they used an actual wolf for the werewolf attack scenes like they did with Bela the Gypsy, maybe that could have worked better and you could still use Jack Pierce's design. And this design, as iconic as it is, and it really has resonated over the years, I just don't think it succeeds like so many of his other makeups have. But Jack Pierce, I'm sorry, but they just can't all be winners. But even though those things do definitely hurt the movie for me, there are still things in it that do work. Like I said, the investigation element is unique. And one thing that has been done in other werewolf movies but is done so well in this one are the growing suicidal thoughts of Larry Talbot. That at a certain point he feels so guilty for possibly being complicit in these murders that he just wants to end himself. He doesn't want to put anybody else in danger, so he has his father chain him up one night so he can't escape, but then he ends up escaping, and the next day he's talking about, so how can a werewolf be killed? And by the end of the movie, you do feel like this man just wants to die. He just wants to end it. And Lon Chaney Jr., I don't think gets enough credit as a really good dramatic actor. And it is a shame that whenever people talk about the Wolfman, it always tends to center around the wolf and the look of the wolf and the transformations, and not about the human element of the Wolfman. And again, I think if they held back on the werewolf transformations, this would have become the forefront of the movie, and it would make it a lot more engaging and set it apart from the other werewolf movies that have come later that have focused more on the transformations and the bestial nature of a werewolf, where here they focus more on the human side of being a werewolf and having this curse and what to do about it. But for me, this movie really isn't reaching that potential that I see in it because it has that split mind over showing the werewolf and the werewolf transformations and showing the murders versus showing more of the human side. And it's that split that kind of makes this movie just another werewolf movie. And while the tropes and werewolf lore that started with this movie are continually expanded upon and developed further to this day, and that shows just how much of this movie is good and did resonate with people. Going back to it all these years later, the movie just doesn't have that unique an identity anymore that it might have had in 1941, because at the end of the day it just feels like another werewolf movie, and we have tons of them now. And aside from some of the performances and the classic universal gothic atmosphere, there's really nothing in this movie that hasn't been done as good or better in other werewolf movies. And I didn't know where to fit this in, but when they go to the gypsy camp and they're having their celebration, you see this woman dancing on a stage with a tambourine, being fairly seductive, and I can't help but think, is that Esmeralda from Hunchback of Notre Dame? Because the dress she's wearing looks very much like a dress that Esmeralda would wear. I think it's interesting that Lon Chaney Jr.'s big Universal monster debut involves gypsies and has an Esmeralda type figure that very much mirrors his father Lon Chaney Sr.'s big Universal monster debut with Hunchback of Notre Dame. And this is when my theory brain gets going, because did these gypsies that arrived in Wales originate in Paris, and that Esmeralda is the same Esmeralda that had the experience of Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney as Quasimodo? Because if that's true, then that Esmeralda is the connection between Lon Chaney Sr. and Lon Chaney Jr. I'm just thinking that's just too perfect to be a coincidence. And I think it's kind of a sweet send-up to Lon Chaney's father, who made a name for himself in makeup. And when his son is trying to fill their shoes, to have a reminder of who his father was is just kind of sweet. So those are my thoughts on The Wolfman. It's by no means my favorite Universal monster movie, but it does have some things to admire and appreciate about it, even if it doesn't all come together as perfectly as something like Frankenstein. And if you're curious as to my ranking of the Universal monster movies that I've reviewed so far, here they are. And if you want to know more about my thoughts on any one of those movies, I made a playlist called Universal Monsters up here somewhere. But now I turn it over to you guys. What is your favorite Universal monster movie? I'm really curious, because it seems like everybody has their own opinion about what makes a good Universal monster. So leave that in the comments below, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.